Gary, welcome to the Decision Making Studio podcast. This is an honor. Thank you for taking some time to chat with me. I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it as well.
Where I'd like to start is your work and your background in this thing called naturalistic decision making. And I want to just talk a little bit about what that is. And if I think about the present context, I almost feel like this is something that maybe has gotten, I don't know, maybe it's a little bit forgotten or not really considered because we hear a lot about biases, heuristics, and errors. I hear a lot about that, but I want to just learn a little bit more about where, like, the origins of what is naturalistic decision making and how did it come about? How did you get interested in this?
Sure. So the naturalistic decision-making movement started in the mid-1980s, and the first conference was 1989. And it was put on by the Army. The Army needed to know, how do people make tough decisions, life and death decisions, under time pressure and uncertainty? And they looked at the existing research and tried to put it into practice, and it didn't get them anywhere. So they were really motivated to find an alternative approach. And the Army Research Institute put together a program of researchers who had been working not in a laboratory, but with actual decision makers. And I was part of that program. The essence of naturalistic decision making is to understand how people make high stakes decisions, or even shopping decisions in a grocery, but people making the kind of daily life decisions or professional decisions that they have to be able to handle. And how do they do it? There's usually uncertainty. There's usually ambiguity. Sometimes there's time pressure. Sometimes there's not. But we wanted to see, how is this happening in practice? And along the way, we found that the laboratory research that had been conducted wasn't really providing the answers, because the research was bringing in college students, sophomores, giving them tasks they had never seen before, and trying to determine how they performed. And the tasks were usually very well defined. So of course you want to know what was a right answer or a wrong answer. And that's not the world that we live in. So I had done a study of firefighters, and other people had done studies with other domains, pilots, Navy officers. And so we all realized we had done this work independently. And then as we were joined together in this program, we had this revelation: there's a bunch of us and we're working independently, but we call it naturalistic decision-making because it's decision-making in natural settings with people who are performing their professional activities or their personal activities. And so that meant that we would study decision-making when there was uncertainty, when there were high stakes, which you can't reproduce in a laboratory, when there are organizational constraints, when there are interpersonal constraints, and mostly with people who have some expertise. And that was one of the major ingredients that had been missing from the laboratory research was expertise and how it plays a role in decision making. And now, gosh, the first meeting was 1989. All of a sudden, and we didn't think of it as the first meeting. We thought it was the meeting, and that was going to be it. And somehow we got into a rhythm of having a meeting every 2 years. And we alternate between the United States and the rest of the world So this last meeting was in July 1st to 5th in New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
And the next one will be in Charlottesville, Virginia. So, and this last one was the 17th. None of us thought that would go on this
Right.
long. And yet it has. And now there's a Naturalistic Decision-Making Association. I'm on the board, but I'm not running it. Brian Moon, a good friend and colleague, is running it.
Mm-hmm.
And we have hundreds of members from around the world.
Mm-hmm. And I've heard you describe this before, but perhaps for my listeners, when you think about how someone with, well, first of all, what does it mean to have expertise? What is someone who has some expertise, and how does that differ from, say, experience or something else?
That's an important question. A lot of people think that, you need to see if somebody is an expert, but who knows who an expert is? There are no clear criteria. So that's why I try not to talk about experts. I talk about gaining expertise.
Okay.
Which means, being able to size up situations quickly, being able to recognize what to do, being able to anticipate what might happen next, being able to determine this is a goal that's worth pursuing versus a goal that's not. People with expertise can make those kinds of judgments. It's different from experience, because there are people who have lots of experiences, but never really learned from them. So, let's take a physician. A physician, say somebody who wants to work in emergency medicine. And they have a chance for an internship. They're going to choose an emergency department if they have that opportunity, in a large city where there's lots going on, rather than a rural department. So, to develop expertise, it's not just how many years of experience you have. It's how many tough cases you have and how many times you failed, but also not just how many times you failed, what you learned from the failure. Did you get feedback that was useful? Can you diagnose what happened, what went wrong, what went right? So all of that is part of developing expertise. It's not simply years of experience.
Right. How would, say, I'm thinking about someone who might be listening to this, who let's say they're COO, or someone who's on they run a leadership team, or something along those lines. They lead people, and they're presented with decisions that are really complex. Like I know you talked about I've heard you talk about wicked problems, but what do we do? What markets should we be in for the next 3 years, or should we launch this product or something like this? And they might be wondering, do I have expertise? How do I know? Are there some questions I can ask to figure that out? Or, how would you approach that?
No, expertise, right. But first of all, but there are ways to get a sense.
Okay.
What you're capable of. So certainly years of experience you might look at that, but we know that that's not enough. We might look at, what kinds of, tests or qualifications you've been able to achieve. When I try to gauge if somebody has expertise, one of the things I'll do is I'll ask them, tell me the last time that you made a mistake. And the real expert, the people with expertise, they answer immediately, because it's been burning at them that they made a mistake, and they've been thinking, what should I have done? Or if I'd handled it this way, what would have happened? And that's a good sign. That's how we develop expertise, is we learn from failures and we build stronger mental models. But if somebody tells me, and it often happens, I can't think of any mistakes. Now, very dubious that they have expertise, because they don't have a mindset for building expertise, and they don't have motivation to develop expertise. So that's a part of it for me. I might use hypotheticals. So if somebody says, here's what I think we should do, and I'll say, what if that happens? What would you do then? And I find that people with expertise, when you throw a curve at them, they kind of get interested. Like, I hadn't thought about that. Let's see, how would that work? The people who I'm less confident in get flustered, because they become proficient because they know how to follow the routines, but they're not skilled enough or wise enough to be able to adapt and to think of things in different ways. So those are some of the criteria.
Right. What's interesting in what you say there as well is, I'm curious your thoughts on this. Someone who uses a lot of qualifying language is maybe that's an indicator of more expertise than someone who sort of blusters in with lots of confidence, maybe false bravado. However, it seems like in many organizations, the sort of confident, bravado person is the one that seems to get more belief in their views, as opposed to someone who might say, well, on the one hand, this, on the other hand, that. Yeah, I'm just curious how to maybe think about and overcome this.
So I had a very enjoyable and fruitful collaboration with the late Daniel Kahneman.
Yes.
And we wrote a paper together. And we agreed on some things. We disagreed on a number of things. One of the things we strongly agreed on is the confidence that they express is not a good indicator of how good they are. There are people who have mastered the art of seeming bold and ready who aren't. So I'll tell you a story. One of the ways that we build decision-making skills and expertise is we use scenarios. There's a shadow box method we use now. Prior to that, and sometimes even still, we use tactical decision games or decision-making exercises. And we were doing my company was doing a project with the petrochemical industry. And they got interested in doing a decision-making exercise. And they had two of their staff who had been working outside in the cold and the harsh weather, checking valves and just going around the plant. And they were ready to be promoted to move inside and work on the panel. And that was a nice promotion. And one of them, he just carried himself like you just knew that he understood what was needed. And the other one was a little wishy-washy. He was, well, it could be this or it could be that. And he just didn't have that kind of confidence. So they were training them using decision-making exercises, and they were astonished. The one with the bravado, as he went through the exercises, they saw he wasn't ready. He looked like he carried himself like he was ready, but his responses, his impulses were all in the wrong direction. And this other guy who is much more nuanced and more hesitant, he got it. He understood the essence of each of the situations they threw at him, and he was ready. And so he was promoted, and the first guy was told, we're going to send you out for another year, and then we'll test you again. So the confidence was totally misleading. It wasn't until you tested them with scenarios that you could see what they were made of.
Hmm. Right. I want to talk about how many or what proportion of our decisions are kind of made with this sort of naturalistic lens. And then I want to go back to talk about, can you train that? Because you talk about how you train that, but I think I may have come across that 90% of our decisions are kind of, is it instinct? Is that the right word? Or naturalistic? What is that the right percentage?
I would say that was accurate. Those are data that we've collected and other people have collected.
Okay.
In psychology, there's sometimes, and other disciplines, there's a replication crisis. People doing research and others can't repeat it, which casts doubt on it. But the work that we've done on our model of decision making, called the recognition prime decision model, we've replicated it and others have replicated it. So people are fairly confident, and maybe overconfident, fairly confident that it describes what people actually do. And what they don't do is they don't set up a matrix like, here's my options and here are the evaluation dimensions, and rate each option on each dimension and see which one comes out ahead. They don't do that. Hardly ever do people do that. They're able to use their expertise to recognize what's going on in the situation, what they should pay attention to, what they can pay less attention to, because attention is a finite resource. What are the goals that they can be pursuing, and what's a likely course of action that will be successful for them. That's what they're doing. And that comes with what some people call intuition. I would call it expertise and pattern matching. But that's not all that they do. So if I go through that process and I say, here's what I think needs to be done, there's a second part, which is not intuition, where I think, here's what my impulse is telling me to do this. Let me imagine how that would work in this particular situation, in this context. And they run it through their head to see if it'll be successful or if they can spot any problems. So that's a conscious and deliberate effort. So I'm not saying that people just go with their gut and just do the first thing that pops in their mind. That's not the case. We're dealing with people who are making high stakes decisions. You're talking about financial decisions, firefighters, police officers, pilots, physicians, nurses. All of these are high stakes decisions. They don't want to make mistakes. So they check themselves. And if the first impulse looks like it's going to be successful, they're ready to go. That's how they can make decisions so quickly. If it's almost successful, then they think, can I tweak it some? Maybe I can improve it and eliminate the flaw. And if they can't, they say, okay, what else can I do? And they keep going down. They have like a repertoire of possible actions until they find one that they're comfortable with. They don't know if it's the best, because who knows what's the best? That's an impossible judgment. They just want the first one that they think is going to work in this situation.
How do you train that so that people get better at it?
So, tell you how not to train.
Okay.
Because this is the first impulse. When I tell people about this model, this recognition prime decision model that we generated, 1985. So it's almost 40 years. You'd think that it would have been replaced by now. I'm expecting that it will be, but so far it's holding up. I don't need it to hold up forever. It's been exciting and informative. So what you don't want to do is tell people, here's the recognition prime decision model, as if it's something that they can follow. That's not going to help at all. And after we came up with the model, I'll be honest with you, we didn't know how to train it. We didn't know what to do about it. And over the years, we started to make some discoveries and realized, well, we could give people vicarious situations. We can give them scenarios. And then in 2010, I had the good fortune of meeting a firefighter, a deputy commander, Neil Heinz.
Mm-hmm.
And he had just done a project in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. He had built scenarios to train people to handle situations that weren't part of their prior experience, just so that they could develop that kind of flexibility. And I loved his method and worked with him, and we developed something called Shadowbox, which is a way of giving people scenarios. Now, one of the difficulties of training people is how do you evaluate what they've done? How long does it take to evaluate it? Mm-hmm. And do you have like an expert watching them? But experts are expensive and they're hard to schedule. So what Heinz had figured out and what we do with Shadowbox, I would put you in a situation and it would be a tough case. And as it unfolded, I'd stop the action and I'd say, at this point, you've got to make a decision. Here's 4 options. I want you to rank order which of these you prefer, second, third, and fourth, and write down the reasons why you rank ordered it that way. And then we'd go on with the scenario and then we'd stop it again. And we'd say, all right, here's 3 goals you can pursue. Rank order them and write down your reasons why you ranked them that way. And then we go on again and then we stop it again and we say, here's 5, you need more information. Here's 5 pieces of information you can pursue. Rank order them and write down your reasons. And it goes on like that. Mm-hmm. Now, we've also had a small group of people with experience, people we might call experts, and they've gone through the same scenario. They've done their ranking. They've written down their reasons. And so when I've done my ranking and written down my reasons, right away I get feedback from what the experts had. We've combined their data and we say, okay, Gary, this is what you picked as your number 1 choice. Here's what the experts picked as their number 1 choice. Mm. And I want mine to match theirs. So that's the game-like quality.
Right.
But the real learning is what were their reasons?
Right.
Because now I'm getting a sense of what they're seeing, the inferences they're making that never even occurred to me. So this is a way to have expert feedback without the experts having to be there. Mm. This is a way of seeing what the experts are seeing, because we're both looking at the same scenario, but they're seeing so much more than I am. Mm. And I have a window into their expertise.
That sounds so incredibly valuable. And I like how the show your workings is an interesting concept. It's probably something, because I'm thinking about decision making and decisions. And if we get much better at, there's this concept of a decision journal where you can, you show what you knew and how and anyway, it's a very, that sounds very, very useful.
Let me just also add one more thing.
Yes, of course.
Sometimes my responses don't match that of the so-called experts.
Right.
I'll say, what makes them experts? I don't agree with that. Mm-hmm. And our response is, we're not saying that they're right.
Right.
We're saying, here are their reasons. Look at their reasons. See what you can learn. They're not giving you ground truth. There is no ground truth. These are ambiguous situations. But you can build a richer mental model by having this opportunity to get inside the heads of the experts.
Mm-hmm. Do you find sometimes that those being trained then see things the experts don't?
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, we often do this in groups, and that's part of the experience of running a group is somebody will say, well, what if this happened? Or what about this possibility? And maybe the experts hadn't considered it. Maybe they just hadn't written it down when they went through the exercise, but it's a chance to explore new ideas. And that's what you want to have happen. You want to help people on this journey to expertise. You want them to be speculating. You want them to be curious. And that's what we're trying to promote we're trying to build their expertise, and we're trying to strengthen their mental models, and we're trying to help them notice things that they hadn't noticed before, so that they're just getting better, and they're able to make better decisions because of it.
This great stuff. We could dive into this a bit more, but I also want to, I want to talk about the PreMortem technique. So, maybe we're shifting gears here. But I would be remiss if we didn't talk about it, because you're very well known for the PreMortem, and it comes up again and again and again. And, in my work, and I thought, I'd like to talk to the guy who came up with it, because it's I'm not sure if it's always being applied in the right way. But I'm thinking about, you have this equation: performance improvement equals errors, down arrow, plus insights, up arrow. And if I'm not mistaken, this PreMortem is about reducing error. Is that right? Could you talk to us about the origins of the PreMortem, and maybe how it works, and maybe we could start with the origins, perhaps.
Okay, let me start with the diagram that you sketched out for your listeners and viewers. And it's one of my favorite diagrams because it's so simple. It says, if you want to improve performance, and it shows two arrows. One is pointing down and one is pointing up. The one that's pointing down is what you want to reduce. You want to reduce errors. That's a way of improving performance. But that's not enough. I don't want to come home at the end of the day and tell my family, I had a great day today. I didn't make any mistakes.
Yeah.
And that's not what I'm all about. So the arrow pointing up is what you want to increase. You want to increase insights. You want to increase expertise. The problem is most organizations only focus on the down arrow. They have all kinds of methods for proceduralizing tasks and spotting errors. And they don't have any programs in place for increasing insights and expertise. And that creates a lopsided environment, and it creates an environment where people are afraid of making mistakes rather than trying to do their job and maybe explore new pathways that will allow them to be more successful, but they haven't been done before. So there's a risk. Now you have people who are afraid to take those risks because the organization is so focused on reducing errors. And they don't really care about insights. Once I had a conversation with one of the intelligence agencies, and they had all these techniques for trying to reduce errors, spot mistakes. And I said, that's interesting. What do you have in place for increasing insights? And they looked at me and said, why would we do that? Well, that's why we're paying you money to come up with insights, not to reduce mistakes. But they knew that if I make a mistake, people will see it. If I don't have an insight, nobody will know. So it became lopsided. So even though I'm really very much interested in the up arrow, I'm well known for this down arrow because of the PreMortem. So let me answer your question where did the
Okay.
pre-mortem come? And how does it work? The essence of a pre-mortem is you take your team. Usually, when we do it, when we're starting a new project, you take the team at the very beginning. There'll be a kickoff meeting, and we'll reserve maybe 20 minutes at the end for a pre-mortem. And we'll say, now we're going to do a pre-mortem. We know the plan. We know what we're supposed to be doing. We have the timetables. Everybody has their marching orders, what their role is. And now I'm looking in an infallible crystal ball. And the project has failed. The plan didn't work. This has been a disaster. We know that the project failed. We know that. There is no doubt. Now, everybody around the table, take 2 minutes, write down all the reasons why the project failed. And everybody who was so happy with the plan before, they're writing like crazy.
Mm.
And we compile what they have, and people are amazed at all the different ways, all the different flaws that hadn't come up during the kickoff and during the preparation. And the pre-mortem essentially liberates people from trying to protect the plan and defend it, and they don't want to have any doubt in it. And the pre-mortem pushes that aside and says it's a different mindset. We're imposing a temporary mindset of failure. Use your imagination and your experience and your intelligence and tell me why this project failed. And people are competitive. I want to come up with better reasons than you do. And plausible reasons. And then, of course, so we've done research and we show that people going through the pre-mortem, it seems to really reduce overconfidence, which is a typical problem when a project gets started, because people think, of course it's going to work, because they haven't imagined ways that it might not. So it reduces their inappropriate confidence in the plan. And so it seems to have an effect. Where did it come from?
Yeah.
It came in the late 1980s. We would do projects. Most of I had a different company then, Klein Associates. I eventually grew to 37 people before I sold it. And most of our projects worked, but not all of them, to be honest. And when a project didn't turn out well, maybe it was a failure. Maybe it was just disappointing. It didn't accomplish what we really were hoping for. We do a postmortem, an after-action review. Now, postmortem in medicine is you do an autopsy on a patient who died. And the advantage of a postmortem is the physician can find out what did the patient really die from. Sometimes they're not sure. And then the physician can tell, the physician benefits, and the physician can tell the family, and the family now knows what happened. And if it's something interesting and noteworthy, the physician might write up a note. And now the medical community benefits. So everybody benefits from a postmortem. Everyone except the patient, because the patient is dead.
Right.
So we said, we're doing these postmortems of the projects that didn't work out. Wouldn't it be nice to do this up front and maybe reduce the chance that projects are going to fail? Well, I made up this exercise of a pre-mortem and made up just how it would run. And we never intended it to get out from our company. This was just something that we were doing.
Right.
And I don't even know how it got out. It's sort of like escaped from the bottle, and people heard about it. People are using it. I think I'm better known for this pre-mortem then for the recognition prime decision model, I developed with the techniques we have for cognitive interviewing. But you made a good point, Ben. A lot of people who use it aren't doing it right and are hindering the effectiveness of the PreMortem. So I've developed some video materials, and I'll be developing more on PreMortem and mistakes to avoid and how to carry it out. But I don't know who uses a PreMortem. Nobody tells me. I just hear, oh, we did a PreMortem. We're doing it on Wall Street. We're doing it with wildland firefighting. This is all news to me.
Right. Is there a common error that people make when doing them that you're aware of? Or I guess if you don't have knowledge of how it's being used, you don't have knowledge of, common errors, but are there a couple of things that you're like, that doesn't sound like a PreMortem to me?
Actually, I worked with a few colleagues and who are telling me folks are using the PreMortem on Wall Street, where they say they're using a PreMortem and they're not doing it the way they should. And we identified a few common errors and wrote about that. One common error is people will say, okay, we've finished up the planning. Now we'll do a PreMortem. Does anybody see any problems with the plan? That's the way to ask the question.
Right.
Because people are they're all excited about the project and there's such pressure not to voice any criticism. So it can't be framed that way. It has to be framed, the plan failed. We know the plan failed. Tell us why. So I think that's one of the most common errors that people make. Another mistake that people make is if they're doing it around a team, they'll say, who has any items? And that means you're not going to call on me so I can hide. I don't have to, I'm going to sort of let others take up the strain. But with a PreMortem, everybody gets called on and, everybody is expected. And we had one project that we did. This is the first time we did the PreMortem with a customer. And the customer turned out, he's now a good friend of mine, but it was an Air Force project, U.S. Air Force. And the project, and then the customer was a lieutenant colonel. And it was a big project, going to be a multi-year project with lots of different subcontractors. And it was a 3-day kickoff. And I told him as we prepared for it, we're going to do a PreMortem at the end. And he said, what's a PreMortem? And I said, here's what the PreMortem is. And he said, no way, because it's too discouraging. I don't want to sap people's confidence. I said, you're trusting me with the project. You have to, you need to trust my judgment. I think it'll be important. So we're doing the PreMortem. We're going around the room. It's about building a new system to be put out in the field, and everybody's excited about it. And we get to this young Air Force captain who hasn't said a word for the past 3 days, who's just there trying to avoid notice, and he's just, sitting in. And we said, what do you have at the top of your list? And he looks around nervously and he said, the system you're building, the software is far too complex and far too demanding compared to the computers they have in the field. And it simply won't run on the computers that we have in the field. And everybody sat back and realized he was totally right. Now, if he hadn't said that, we would have spent the next 6 months or a year building a system that could never be fielded. So it saved the program. The program turned out to be a huge success, but without his contribution, it wouldn't have happened. And left to his own devices, he never would have brought it up.
Mm. Fascinating. And the topic of timing, comes up to, it's the timing is important. You don't do one after the resources have been committed and the program's in motion, which is what you were describing. It has to be done when the decision is made. Otherwise, what's the point? Mm-hmm. I want to flip to insights. And what's interesting to me is that I'd like to get your views on this, but would the PreMortem not have existed if it didn't come about in your work somehow without an insight, right? So, it's almost, is kind of an irony perhaps that we wouldn't have PreMortems if we were trying to reduce error. So that just be useful to perhaps get your thoughts on that. And then what's an insight?
Okay. So you had mentioned before that the PreMortem is mostly about the down arrow, and you're right. It's about reducing errors. But it's not just about reducing errors, because kinds of things give us insights about the dynamics of the different components of the project, of the program, and allow us to learn and get smarter about the environment we're working in. So PreMortem contributes some to the up arrow, but it's mostly about the down arrow.
Okay.
So let's talk about insights. But before I do, I'm going to say something that will upset many of your listeners and viewers. There's a belief that if you're going to start a project, you need to do a thorough literature review first. And then, only then, after you know what's been done before, can you plug into it. And that sounds reasonable. That's the way I was trained in graduate school. You always start by looking at the literature, because other people might have come up with ideas that you had missed. The problem with that is that it straitjackets you into what's been done before and how people have thought about it before, so that you don't have the scope for making your own judgment and forming your own impressions and seeing things that others haven't seen. So when I did my research on decision making, I had never taken a class in decision making in graduate school. There hadn't been any in my program. I certainly hadn't read a great deal of the literature. I just wondered, how can people make life and death decisions in just a minute or so? Because according to all of the current theories about setting up a matrix or a decision tree or something like that, it takes too much time. It can take like up 30 minutes to set up one of those matrices. And firefighters and police officers and pilots and nurses, doctors don't have that amount of time. So how is it possible? And I just wondered how it was possible. And I didn't know. So we started by interviewing firefighters and observing them, slept over in a fire station just to see how they were doing it out of curiosity. And because we weren't lingered by the existing models, we could have an honest inquiry and an open expression of curiosity to see what's going on here. The same thing with, and then later I read more of the literature, because you have to, and people expect you to, and the literature has important things to say. So I'm not saying never look at the literature, but maybe don't start with the literature. Start with your own curiosity, so that you have fresh eyes. And the same thing happened with my work on insight. There's a vast literature on insight, and I collected dozens of books.
Hmm.
And I didn't read any of them because I wanted to keep an open mind. So I collected 120 examples of insights. And I tried to imagine how the insight was formed. What do I know? These were examples that I had read, I've found in magazines and journals and in some books as well. And I just collected this corpus of insights. And I tried to see, is there a common theme for how people form insights? And I couldn't find any. But I realized that there were a couple of different approaches, so that there are different pathways for forming insight. And the literature hadn't talked about that because the literature had given people toy problems to solve within the parameters of a laboratory study. And I was looking at examples of people who actually formulated insights. And then later on, I went back and read the books after I came up with my model, my account of insight. But that came after. It wasn't before, because I wanted to look at it with fresh eyes. So what I found is that there are different pathways for insights. Some of the insights we come up with is that we see a connection between different things. And all of a sudden, now I think I know what's going on. Darwin, wondering about these different species. He saw a different species. He wondered, how did they come about and why were they different on one island than another? And then he read Malthus. He read the 6th edition. So lots of people had read Malthus before Darwin turned to it. And Malthus was talking about competition for scarce resources and how the effect it would have on populations. And Darwin said, that could be the mechanism. And now we had a mechanism for evolution, and what was driving it was a competition for scarce resources. And then later on, sexual selection is added to that mix. So he put those ideas together and came up with a theory of evolution that has such tremendous impact. So that's one pathway, this putting ideas together, connecting ideas. Another is disconnection. These things don't fit together. Something is wrong. There's an anomaly. Why? What's happened there? An example that I like to use, told to me by a police officer during an interview that I was conducting. So the officer's driving in the city and it's crowded and he's stuck in traffic. And he's got a young officer next to him who's riding with him. He must be a field training officer. And he's waiting for the light to turn so he can get on his way. The young officer is looking at the car ahead, and it's a brand new BMW. And he sees the driver take a drag on a cigarette, flick the ashes. And the young officer says, that doesn't make sense. Who flicks the ashes in a brand new BMW? That's weird. So they light him up and pull him over. Sure enough, it was a stolen car. Okay, so that's another path for insight, is seeing anomalies, seeing disconnections, and trying to investigate further to see what's at the basis of it. And there are additional pathways as well, and we're still determining new pathways like seeing affordances. But there are multiple pathways for gaining insight. And now we're trying to formulate techniques to help people gain more insights, especially in the financial arena. So I still go back to my corpus of 120 cases and read those cases, and I just get inspired by these people who came up with insights. And I think how smart, how creative these people are. It's a source of pleasure to read the material.
what's the role of intuition in the creation of insights? How can we tap that a bit more?
Okay, so intuition sometimes scares people because they think it's like extrasensory perception. It was my intuition that told me what to do. I think we have impulses about what to do, and it's based on our experience and the patterns we've built up, and we aren't consciously aware of it. So it feels kind of occult to us. It was I just had a police officer. I was just reading another case study of this. He's interviewing this man who's reported that his child is missing. And the officer is getting the data and trying to find out as much as he can. But something is off about the interview. That the man whose child has just maybe been kidnapped isn't showing the kinds of emotions and showing the reactions. Something bothered him and then prompted him to investigate further. And it turned out that the man had killed his son. And he didn't know that the man had killed his son. He just knew something is wrong.
Right.
So people, that was an insight.
Right.
But it was also an intuition. And it was an intuition that was not extrasensory perception, but this man was not acting the way most people would. There was a violation of a pattern. There was something. So intuition is really based on the patterns we build up that allow us to judge what's typical and what's an anomaly. And so intuition is how we use our experience to make judgments.
Does that sometimes show up as a feeling, as a physical sensation, or is
A physical, the hairs in the back of your neck stand up. This is spooky. So yes, we experience it not just consciously, but also emotionally and physically. That something isn't fitting here. Something is wrong. But we don't know what it was. The police officer didn't know that the man had killed his son. He didn't know that. He just knew there's something off here.
Right.
Something isn't right. We use our experience to make decisions. Insight is how we come up with new ideas. So we're not drawing on what we've known before. Right. We're going beyond what we've known before. We're speculating. We're making discoveries.
Right. And you have this also creative desperation path that you talk about. Could you explain that a little bit?
Well, we know we've sort of modified the model since we talked about creative desperation. But creative desperation, I'm playing a chess game, playing with you, and you rat. You've got me trapped here.
Right.
I don't think it's a good continuation. So what if I do this? I don't think you're prepared for me to move my knight this way. And it might be a disaster, but I'm already in a disaster. So, this is the best I can do. Let's try it. So I'm desperate, but I'm seeing something that I wouldn't have ordinarily noticed, but I'm desperate. And the example that I use is, Wagner Dodge and the Mann Gulch incident where they were fighting a forest fire. And it was a gulch, and the fire was on the other side of the gulch, away from them. So they were safe, and they were hiking down the gulch. They had been dropped off, and they were hiking down the gulch towards the river. And then Wagner Dodge, who's in charge of it, sees some smoke on his side of the gulch. And he immediately gets a sense the fire, maybe a gust of wind had brought some sparks over, and it's August, it's hot, it's dry, and it's starting a fire on our side of the gulch, and fire is spread up, and it's going to spread up the gulch where we are. We are toast, literally and figuratively. We have maybe a few minutes left to live because it's going to come roaring at us. And so he tells his crew, run for your lives, because now they're in a race with this fire that's just getting started. And they're running for their lives. And he looks back, and the fire is roaring up the gulch. And he knows he and most of the men aren't going to make it. And they're running through this thick grass that's slowing them down. And they're uphill and they're exhausted. And the fire is coming up. And how does he get out of it? And he said, this grass, no, it's getting in my way. But wait a second. I can start my own fire. I can start a fire and have it spread up the gulch in front of me, because the grass is the fuel that the fire is using. And I can eliminate the fuel by starting an escape fire. And he does that. And he dives into the ashes, and he is saved. That's an example of creative desperation, because he's in the middle of a forest fire. Why would he start another fire? He had never heard of it. He had never thought of it before. But he had this insight that the grass, that's the fuel for the fire, I can get rid of it. I can burn it off. And
yeah. And it wouldn't have occurred to him if he hadn't had that sort of desperate sense. But then it's just, my mind immediately goes to, well, how can we create this? Like, how can we create the conditions where insights can happen more frequently, in a safe way, obviously.
Right. We're working on that. We have some idea. One idea is a lot of insights are formed when you see an anomaly. What do people do when they think they've understood a situation and then something unexpected happens? They explain it away because they think they're happy with their explanation. Well, okay, most of the time it makes sense to explain it away, except sometimes the anomaly might be useful. Sometimes the anomaly might be telling you something that's worth examining. So perhaps don't be so quick to explain anomalies away, especially if you've misdiagnosed the situation. The anomaly should be increasing. So keep track of the anomalies and don't try to dismiss them too quickly. That's one idea that we've been promulgating.
Right. It's, fascinating. So I'm conscious of time, and I want to be respectful of your time. I did have a quick, I don't know how quick, but just really quickly is just, this concept of bias I've heard you talk about, but like, is debiasing even a possibility? I've heard, I've used this. I've actually been guilty of saying, well, we need to debias, right? And in fact, I've actually said, PreMortem might be a good way of debiasing. And I'm just wondering, have I committed some type of grave error here, by saying that? Can we actually debias, or do you look at this concept of bias in a different way?
Right. So I am not a fan of this notion of biases. I don't think it's useful. I don't think it's constructed. This was an area where Danny Kahneman and his colleague Amos Tversky, that's where they made their reputation, and did a series of marvelously designed studies to show how people would make the wrong decision. Now, to do those studies, they were really demonstrating that people use heuristics.
Right.
And they weren't using algorithms where follow these steps and you'll be sure of getting a right answer. They were using rules of thumb.
Mm-hmm.
And not just that they were using them, Kahneman and Tversky identified some common rules of thumb, heuristics that people used. How do you demonstrate that people are using them? They said, let's create scenarios where these rules of thumb will take people in the wrong direction and see if they make the wrong answer because they're using the heuristics, because heuristics aren't perfect. And that's what happened. And they demonstrated that that people would use the heuristics. And that's what you would expect, because the heuristics that we use are very powerful and very useful. And if you stripped away our heuristics, we would be pretty helpless. And Kahneman and Tversky, I don't believe that they were saying that people are inherently biased. They were saying people use heuristics which aren't perfect. But the field got excited. Look, people make mistakes, and we can show that they make mistakes, because people are so interested in the down arrow. And so this whole notion of people are inherently biased came up. And along with it, maybe we can find ways to debias people. If you debias people, you'd strip away useful heuristics, and you would hurt them. You wouldn't help them. Fortunately, attempts to debias people have largely failed. So we don't have to worry about that. But that's what people have been trying to do, and it's a mistaken approach. And
Right.
I'd like to see it die away, but I don't expect that it will. I came up with the idea, and I'm wondering if these heuristics are being used by people, why aren't the researchers studying the positive aspect and demonstrating that? And I think that would be a fruitful line of research, but I haven't seen much evidence for it.
Right. And why can't we lean into heuristics and train certain, I think training heuristics or knowing when to use them or whatever might be a more valuable way of making decisions than a big convoluted process.
Right. If I'm going to use a heuristic like anchoring, put me in scenarios so I can develop some expertise about how to anchor more accurately and more effectively, and determine what's a useful anchor and what's not, and just help build my expertise rather than trap me.
Right. Yeah. I think that makes sense. I could keep talking to you, but I want to be, I want to be respectful of your time, but you do have, before we go, you do have a book coming out, right? Called Snapshots of the Mind. And could you just tell us a little bit about that one?
Sure. The book came out almost 2 years ago.
Oh, okay. Apologies. Yeah.
Snapshots of the Mind. It's a series of essays that I wrote for my Psychology Today blog. And I've been writing for a number of years, maybe 8 or 9 years, and decided I would select the essays that I thought would be the most interesting and useful for readers. So I selected them, and then I did a little bit of editing and wrote some descriptions about some of the essays, and MIT Press was kind enough to publish it. So I'm very, very, very pleased with the way the book came out. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Fantastic. And the other thing that you have is this masterclass on practical decision making, which is a video series, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. That's just about to come out now. By the time people see this interview, it will be out. And I developed it a little less than a year ago. It's a masterclass in practical decision making. And rather than getting into issues of theory and conceptual disagreements, I said, what do people really need to know about decision making? can I identify anything that I've learned that I think would be useful for a wider audience? And I identified a number of what lessons that I think are important, boiled them down into 15 lessons, and created a script. So each episode is only 5 minutes. Somebody can watch it, watch one episode a day, 5 minutes, and get through it in just a couple of weeks. And there's a QR code. I don't know if you're going to make people.
I'll put that in. Sure.
Will people be able to use that to access the course?
I'll put the QR code and the link in the show notes as well.
Okay, that's excellent. So I'm very pleased with the way this turned out, and I think people who go through the course will enjoy it tremendously.
Mm-hmm. Gary, this was fabulous. Before we go, was there anything that you wanted to mention that we didn't get enough time to do so?
Nothing pops out. I think we could have used another hour or two to get.
Sure. Yeah.
You did a great job of hitting all the key issues.
Thank you very much. This was an honor. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
My pleasure very much. Thanks for the opportunity.